Hi, in this video I'll tell you about some versions of the Milgram obedience experiment you might not be familiar with. I think a lot of people are familiar with the original experiment because they see the video in their Psych 101 class. The original experiment was done at Yale University, and in the original experiment, each volunteer or participant came into a room, and they were sat down in a chair in front of this fake shock machine. And the fake shock machine was just this big metal box that had a series of switches on it, and the series of switches ran from one end of the machine to the other. And at one end of the machine, there was a switch that was supposed to be able to give the lowest electric shock, and at the other end of the machine was the switch that was supposed to be able to give the highest electric shock. And in between the two ends of the machine, each switch in the series was supposed to be able to give a higher electric shock than the switch that came before it in the series. And in this experiment, each participant was told that they would be asking questions to a person in another room, and that each time the person in the other room gave an incorrect answer, they would have to give the person an electric shock, and the person in the other room who was giving the answers was really just a recording. There actually wasn't any real person in the other room. The participants were just listening to the recorded answers, and each time the participant heard an incorrect answer on the recording, the experimenter ordered them to give the electric shock, and each time the person on the recording gave another incorrect answer, the participant was ordered to give a higher electric shock than they were ordered to give the last time the person gave an incorrect answer. And the experiment was set up where the person on the recording would keep giving more incorrect answers, and the participant would keep being ordered to give higher and higher electric shocks until finally the participant was ordered to give the highest shock possible. And they found that in this experiment, a high percent of the participants were willing to go all the way to the end and give the highest shock possible. And they thought this experiment showed that a lot of people are willing to obey an authority figure even when the authority figure is telling them to do bad things. But they did a few other versions of this experiment, and they showed, in these other versions, they showed that under certain conditions, less or fewer people are willing to obey the experimenter and go all the way up to giving the highest electric shock. And when they designed one of these versions of the experiment, they thought that maybe some of the experimenter's influence in the original experiment came from the fact that the experiment was being done at Yale University. They thought that maybe since the experimenter who was giving the orders was a member of Yale University and was representing the university, they thought that that might have made the experimenter a stronger authority figure and might have made the participants feel more intimidated or more submissive, and might have made them feel more like they had to obey the experimenter. So in another version of the experiment, they moved the experiment from Yale University to an empty building in the same city as Yale, and they redid the experiment in that empty building. And in that version of the experimenter was no longer a member of Yale University, but was just a random person who was giving orders to the participants. And in this version of the experiment, they found that fewer participants were willing to obey the experimenter and go all the way up to giving the highest shock possible. And they think this showed that the reason that a lot of people were willing to obey the experimenter in the original experiment and go up to the highest shock was because they felt that the experimenter was a strong authority figure, because the experimenter was representing Yale University and was a member of the university, or at least seemed to be a member of the university. And in another version of the experiment, they had the experimenter give the orders to the participants over the phone instead of in person. And in this version of the experiment, fewer participants were willing to obey the experimenter and go all the way up to the highest shock possible. And I think this was because when the distance between the experimenter and the participants was increased, and when the experimenter was no longer physically present, the experimenter's influence on the participants became weaker, and the participants didn't feel as strongly that they had to obey the experimenter and go all the way up to the highest shock. And they also did another version of the experiment where they actually brought an actor into the room with the participant, and they had the actor give the wrong answers. And each time the actor gave a wrong answer, the participant was ordered to grab the actor's arm and place the actor's hand on this fake shock plate. And each time the participant put the actor's hand on the fake shock plate, the actor acted like he was getting a shock. And they found that in this condition, fewer participants were willing to obey the experimenter all the way up to the highest shock possible. And the reason that this happened, the reason that they found this result in this experiment, was probably because when the participants had to actually be close up to the and facing the actor while he was getting the electric shocks, it made the participants feel more uncomfortable with what they were doing, and it made them less willing to obey the experimenter all the way up to giving the highest shock. And also, when they actually had to put the actor's hand on the fake shock plate, it might have made the participants feel that they were more directly responsible for the actor's suffering, because they were actually putting the person's hand on a shock plate instead of just flipping a switch that sort of indirectly caused the person to become shocked. And that might also, if they also felt more directly responsible for giving the shocks, that might have also made them feel more uncomfortable with what they were doing, and might have made them less willing to go all the way up to the highest shock. And I just wanted to share these different versions of the experiment with you. And I might make some videos on some other experiments. And thanks for watching.